Everyone, welcome to the deep dive of the D66, the last coalition member of the minority government that we're going to have to discuss. So this is only opposition parties. What I'm going to talk about today is going to be just the policies of D66 and then also just a bit of the historical context surrounding D66. So, what is D66? Well, you see here the leader, Rob Jetten. As you can see also on the political chart, they are left, center, and progressive. They're a bit more left. They used to be more in the center, but they have, become more left in the last election cycles. This has always been known as very much a really big like center party. Like that is what the one of the kind of like ways to identify D66 was. So what are the general policies that they tend to go for? So they go for kind of like a mixed economy. So the idea is just in general, the individual should be free to do what they want and what they need. But this does mean that you shouldn't just give them complete freedom. You should also have the government help them when this needed, especially if they are poor or if they are struggling with things. So this looks like making sure they have good healthcare, making sure they have good education, all this kind of stuff. So it's kind of like one of the slogans was let everyone free, but let no one fall. That's the kind of like idea behind their policies. That's why it's kind of like a mix of like left-leaning and right-leaning-ish policies. Um, they're also very progressive. So they were one of the parties who really went for the gay marriage law in the 2000s slash late 90s. They wanted to get abortion as a human right within the law, whereas now it is technically still a crime, but it's basically just an allowed crime, so there's no prosecution for it. And they also are very progressive in form of LGBT laws, progressive in form of like euthanasia, trying to expand those kind of things. So it's definitely more progressive than the parts that we've discussed so far. And they're also very pro-European Union. So some of the solutions or problems that we currently have, they want to do via the EU. And they see the EU as generally a good thing. It has used to have like a very strong identification with things like education and climate, to a certain extent also healthcare. And it is still a core part of the party and the identity, but it's not something that they always campaign on heavily. In senses that they will have it be a big section in like their campaign plan. When they are doing campaign talks, they will talk about it, but not always the core point or the core message or the thing that they start with when they are campaigning. And they're giving campaign talks and they're on talk shows and all this kind of stuff. So it's quite maneuverable in this sense. And lastly, what they do is that they want to have a democratic reform. So they want to have more direct influence of the population on politics. This can look like having more votes for municipality, specific positions, or major for mayors or that kind of stuff. Those are more directly elected. And also, they used to be very pro referenda. So it was one of those things where they really want to have more direct influence of the population on these policies. And then basically what happened is we had a 2015 we had also a referendum on what the EU should do with Ukraine. And the referendum was very technical because there's a lot of also about cooperation and what we should or should not do. And it was quite technical, which meant it was not very understandable. A lot of people who voted didn't really understand what they were voting for, or people didn't vote because they thought it was very complex. So what then happened is that even though they used to be big proponents of referenda, when this kind of happened, they kind of like quieted down that they don't talk about as much anymore. Which again also shows kind of like the maneuverability of these policies because it's relatively a broad program that they have. They can kind of like pick and choose what they kind of like leave behind or how to adapt when things go wrong. So, what and about the last election? So they went also like tough on immigration, and this is interesting for two reasons. Is one, they were quite critical of the policies basically being implemented in the last coalition, and secondly, they used to not really campaign on like immigration. And the reason for that was immigration they saw as a policy for the right wing. And what happens is when you talk about it, you make that policy bigger. And since they have like harder campaigning on it and they have like easy solutions, quote unquote, for the problems, this means that you now have a lot of people think about immigration. They see the solutions to the right, and then they feel like, okay, I'm going to vote this because there's a big issue within election cycles. So therefore, they didn't really have a lot of talks about immigration in previous election cycles. But this election cycle, they kind of like said, nope, we're not going to do that. We're also going to be tough on immigration. We say we're going to have less immigration. We want to send out the bad apples. And then this way they try to kind of like co-opt that specific point and then focus on other things. This been Yeah, the way they also try to solve this is also again still through the left progressive lens. So it's like we want to work with the EU to stop asylum seekers, and they also say like, look, uh, a lot of the people who come here are absolutely fine. It's just about the bad apples. They're also causing problems within the asylum seeker centers and that kind of stuff. So it's still in that sense still something they can mix with their identity and explain via the principles that they stand for. Um, and then that's how they're able to focus on the immigration side. They also have like of somewhat easier headlines. So if you look at the campaign plan, it is relatively like easy solutions in the sense of they say for the housing crisis we're going to build 10 cities. Now, if you look at the map of the Netherlands, you can understand it's quite compact because it's quite small and we have roughly 18 million people. So then the question is, where are you going to build these cities? Just space-wise, not even just thinking about the nitrogen crisis, which means that we are unable to build new cities because of the policies we've created, but just like space-wise, where it can be because you have farmland, you have like nature places, but if you're going to destroy those nature places, it's going to be bad for like the climate and also that part of the identity. And basically, at the end, they say like, it's more metaphorical. We don't mean actual tent cities, but it's just a very clear message. Um, Similarly, they had an idea for like education, where they said we're just going to lower the number of people in classes and this and that. But then when you look at the policy itself and the way that they had their plans calculated by the Central Plan Bureau, yeah, let's just say that. They basically say, well, it's going to be only for the lowest level of education, and they prioritize schools which are um, like performing the lowest. So it's one of those things where they just say they have an easy kind of like message, kind of like grippable, and like people understand it. But then if you look at what they actually mean with the execution, it becomes more nuanced and more specific. And what I just meant with doing the calculations, basically, when you have a campaign plan, what you can do is you can go to the Central Planning Bureau and then you can ask them, hey, do a calculation. How much more jobs do you get? How much money you will get in? What will this mean for the budget? Because, if you have economic growth, you can also get more taxes because of that and all this kind of stuff. And this is on a voluntary basis. And then basically, what then happens is you can show that you're doing something correctly, that whether the claims you're making are actually to a certain extent true. And it's just a very economic analysis. Basically, what then also happens is that parties then say what the exact plans are. And then based on that, you can also see the discrepancy between what are the plans that they're going to try to execute and they're going to have calculated by this planning agency compared to what they're putting in their campaign and what they're saying on campaign and that kind of stuff. Not all parties do this. You can imagine some like populist parties like the PVV don't do it because they think it's just, you know, yeah, we could go into about it later, but like basically a lot the all parts do this kind of like also shows you what the exact idea is. It's kind of like a optimistic populism that they went for. So it's clear, easy messages, but still a plan around how they're going to do this. What else do they focus on? They focus on things like more progressive taxes and also new economics. So the idea is just that you have less taxes for people who are in the middle class, and then more tax for people who own more of this, own more land, and like have more capital and that kind of stuff. They also try to focus on things like new economics, where they say what the state should do is it should give an idea of what the economy should look like. Basically, saying like the government should create the boundaries in which the market can develop. And that's basically the idea. So this looks like, okay, we have tech ports in, like I said, Eindhoven or maybe in Twente, and maybe we should develop those more. And we should have more of the government trying to focus on that. And we should have less things like distribution centers, which are basically just these big boxes where you have all your stuff that you buy from Amazon or like Temu or whatever, and they basically get sent there and then they get sent to your specific house. Basically, we have a lot of them. They've been growing. They take a lot of space. We don't have a lot of space in that. So it's kind of question: do you want them there? They also have a lot of like immigrants who work there for very like bad conditions, which can also not always leads to a positive impact in the local economy because a lot of the money gets them back, and a lot of the exports that basically come from those distribution centers also go to the like other nations than the Netherlands. It's kind of like you become like there could be alternatives. Like you could have them more in Germany, you could have them more in Belgium. Do we think this would be a good idea, given that they do give us some economic prosperity, do pay taxes, and that kind of stuff? So it's one of those ideas where they also do say that the state should have more of a direct power over the economy. Now, what's also very important is not just this kind of policy and the general tactics that they had when it comes to policy. It's also the image that they sent. So they focused on Robieta being more optimistic. So having like sleeves out, being like, yes, we had so much chaos for such a long time with the coalition. We should really just get things done. So it's kind of like very similar to Henry Bontebal, as we said in the video about the CDA. But this one was more utopic. So it had more like clear, simple plans. So, for example, when I was thinking back of the D60 campaign, I could think of these kind of like small snippets that they focused on, which were like uh, building those 10 cities. Whereas with the CDA, it's still relatively vague and abstract in mind because it didn't have that snappiness. I think this is also explaining, this is part of, I think, explaining why this was this power within the left. And if you also have emotion about like, leftist populism or like optimistic populism, all this kind of stuff, this could kind of like be a example of how this could potentially look like with like pretty big plans, especially in the campaign, thick things you focus on, and maybe even go in with populist narratives of like immigration, but still having some clear executable plans of how you would implement these kinds of things. So that is the idea of just the last election. That is just on the policies. Now let's get a bit more context. Also, actually, just quickly, as you see, this is Robieta, and this is his boyfriend. So this would be if Robieta's prime minister is the first gay prime minister of the Netherlands, or at least openly gay prime minister. Very interesting. Like during the campaign, they never really talked about this, so they never really made this a big thing. This is just something where they really just focused on the policies. So there wasn't as much identity politics within the Netherlands as you would maybe have in the US, and maybe like other nations like the UK as well. So yeah, what is then the some context? So historically, they do not come very strong in coalition talks. So if you look, for example, even the last coalition talks, a lot of the plans that you got through are just quite right wing and very much a lot like the VVD. So one of the things like that was the mortgage deduction or mortgage interest deduction. That basically D66 also wants to remove, the CDA wants to remove. Those were the two parties who formed the majority of like this minority coalition, because D66 was a large party, and even though CDA was like the third, like the smallest party of the coalition, they still the vast majority. You think they were able to push through this, but because the VVD really like held strong, they basically got those plans through. And this is happening with a lot of other plans as well, where it does read a lot like it's very much VVD. I don't see as much back from D66. You do see some things back, but especially also the narrative around it and what's introduced, that it's quite a lot VVD and not as much D66 as you would have expected from such a coalition. This is not the first time this happened. You also had D66 entering coalition before with also some more right-wing governments. And basically the party which really identified itself on education didn't really fight during the coalition talks to give more funding to education. And basically it got cut, and education plans like education funding got cut and all this kind of stuff. And it's one of those things why D66 sometimes gets big, because they have like new ideas, new policies. Then they come to coalition talks. They don't really always promise on these things. And then and not able to push things through in the coalition, or not be able to execute the plans, or not able to also communicate these plans that they executed in such a way that people believe that they were implementing good policies. And then it kind of like it goes down again. So if you look at the election cycles, D60 has got like a wave platform where it kind of like goes up and down, it goes up and down. And the last one was just quite low. They started from, I think, 9 seats, which is just relatively low for D66, who used to have a lot more seats within the 20s. Like I said, they also used to focus more on like education, and also as a consequence, they were always seen as more of a party for the higher educated. So if you see the way they talked about the policies, it was quite often quite technical also, and saying things like, look, this plan that you have is not allowed by the law, it's not going to go through, won't be able to pass. Like into climate policies, they're just talking about things like science, what we should do. And if you look at the large, like who's the largest group voting on D66, most people, the voting population for D66 is just higher educated. So it's always kind of like the image that they've had. And this election cycle, they just kind of like, with that more optimistic populism, they went more for the feeling side. So like on immigration, they said we should have tighter immigration. Yeah, we should. And then they say we have some plans with the EU and they don't work it out exactly how this would look like. And there are some questions with to what extent they're executable, to what extent are you able to actually get agreements with like southern nations to actually keep those immigrants and not have as many asylum seekers within the Netherlands, all of that kind of stuff. So it's definitely like a more feelings based and just also talking more to people, be like, okay, but what do you feel? What do you need? And like I've like explaining how they could fit that and also adapting their plans to that so they can cater to those kinds of things. Um, what then also is an interesting fact is so the Netherlands, we had some protests basically on just some immigration policies. Basically, there was just a lot of like a protest war against immigration, so like an anti-immigration protest. I'm not gonna go into details what happened there, why they were doing this, but the main thing is that those protests kind of like escalated. So there's a lot of violence happening. The police also was there, and they had like there was a lot of like fighting between the police and these protests as well. And one of the things that happened is that one of the buildings of D66 got kind of like rampaged. So as you see here, like there's a broken window, things got burned, things got thrown into the building. Like it was really, really bad. And basically, what kind of happened is Wilders from the PVV was kind of like just like stoking the fire. So basically, whenever there was a policy which was not necessarily good, it's kind of like on the tweets would be like, "Oh, we need to fight against the government when they're doing these bad things," and supporting, you know, and like doing kind of like sometimes dog whistles, to kind of like say like, "Ah, we should really like protest against these things." But then Wilders does this always two-faced thing where he stokes up the fire, but then never wants to really own up to it and really go full like Trump or like go really full conservative, and doesn't really go like therefore we're anti the establishment, we're really going to change against this, we should really revolt or all this kind of stuff. Partially because like I think there's a lot of checks and balances, and also I don't know if it would be something that's palatable within the climate of the Dutch political climate and people who vote for him. And therefore, what then happens is basically he then also distance himself from these protests afterwards. And then there's also kind of like tension where people like, so look, you were firing them up. And basically, D66 took a really strong standpoint saying, like, look, Wilders did all of these really bad things. Um, Wilders did kind of like flame the fires, basically led to this violence. And therefore, they really try to distance themselves from it. And then there's always just then this question, which is um, how other parties respond. So then the VVD has response to what D66 said here said, well, you shouldn't politicize this. Yes, everyone, all parties agree that this is not good. We should not allow this violence. But you shouldn't politicize this and shouldn't talk about wilderness in this way and this kind of stuff. Basically what they're saying. And then D66 again also went back, like went with like doubled down and said like, no, no, this is like just not acceptable. We shouldn't allow this within politics. And this kind of like I think explains one thing is I think just kind of like the current state of how anti-governmental like protests and this kind of stuff can escalate. How this can also harm parties, and as a consequence, D66 is very, very, very unlikely to form any coalitions with these kind of like far right-wing parties. So this could be PVV, this could be like maybe even Forum for Democracy or Forum for Democracy in English, these kinds of things. And I think this is just important context to know about how people also respond to this and what this actually does for politics. So yeah, that is now on just these protests. Let's then go to the last slide. It's just a quick conclusion. So currently, it is the largest party within the Netherlands, which is quite good. It also got the Prime Minister, Rob Jetten. And basically, as you can see, this is just the coalition. So we have on the left Rob Jetten, Dylan Jussekus in the middle from the VVD, and then we have Henry Bontebal of the CDA on the right. And this minority coalition is now going to personal plans. And like I said, the perception and the narrative is that it's very much a VVD program. And there's this a genuine question of, is the 6060 likely to remain successful? Or will it again be a thing where, because they shifted so much to the right, people will think that it is too weak of a policy platform and they don't believe they're able to execute the plans? Or, and this also can depend on conflict success, will the talks with the other opposition parties shift those things to the left and therefore still be able to implement the policies that they would want? And I think also you can now understand what are the expectations people have of D66. The planned economy, so some right leaning, but also still definitely a state intervening. Having more funding for education, having all this stuff will in the end be able to be pushed through. So yeah, that is the last of the coalition parties. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. I'll try to answer them. And then I see you in the next video in which we talk about the largest opposition party, which is the Green Left Labour Party. Bye.